This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. I'm excited to have Kendra Winchester of Read Appalachia podcast on the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. And I've been following Kendra for a while, and I love the work that she's doing. And I'm going to let her talk about what her podcast is all about.
So I am Kendra. I co-host and do all the other things, one-woman show, as I'm sure you relate to, for Read Appalachia. It started several years ago as an Instagram social media page. And then my background is in podcasting. And so I had a big show that ended. And so I was like, what do I want to do next? And I really wanted to turn Read Appalachia into a podcast and bring bookish discussions to folks everywhere, no matter where you lived in the region, outside the region, around the world. And that turned into Read Appalachia. And now it's on its third season, and it's been a great time.
That's similar to how I started as well. I had a podcast called Southern Salon that I co-hosted, and we did really similar things. It wasn't focused on language as much as I focus on that now, but it was a good experience for me to learn how to podcast. I learned on that show. And then when my co-host couldn't go forward with that, I decided I would turn it into this one. And so,
yeah, it's always lovely to hear different stories of different podcasts. Appalachia has such a rich literary tradition that when I was working in my previous podcast, which also was in books, it's called Reading Women, and we focus on books by about women, often books around the world. I really started getting into Appalachian literature in the second half of that run because of a certain memoir that came out, and I was pretty angry about it. And so I started interviewing Appalachian women, and it was just a delight. It was like after doing so many international books and highlighting those and talking to authors from around the world, it was really like a homecoming. And it was really lovely to be able to take things that I'd learned and promote books from my home region.
Well, I started Talking Appalachian. I co-edited a book called Talking Appalachian in 2013 for the University Press of Kentucky. And I decided I wanted to keep going with that theme in a podcast because there was so much I couldn't put into the book that I thought, well, this is a good way to talk about something that I have a passion about and to educate people. So when I think about my podcast, the word that comes to mind is voice place. And that's not my word. That's Georgella Lyon's word, because she has a lovely essay called Voice Place, and it's about what shapes our spoken voices. That's sort of the root of what I do. And then I do a little bit of places and spaces. I do a little bit of Appalachian literature too. I love to interview authors when I come into contact with authors and talk about their inspirations. And we always come around to language because that's such an important part of how people tell a story.
It's one of the things that I love about your show is also language is often, there's a spoken quality to a lot of language. And so you're able to hear that on audio and be able to analyze language on a sound level and how that connects to culture and so many different aspects, which, the English nerd in me, the language loving nerd in me really appreciate.
Now, what part of Appalachia did you grow up in, and what part of Appalachia do you live in?
So I grew up in Southern Ohio. So I'm originally from Portsmouth. My dad's people are from it's called a hamlet called Higbee. My grandma grew up in Possum Holler, which is a road. My dad's family moved back and forth across the river. So my dad actually grew up in Salyersville, Kentucky. And now they live up in Ashland. I live in the upstate of South Carolina, right on the edge of the southern part of Appalachia in the foothills here. And it's really interesting. The ratio of southern versus Appalachian is very different here, but there's still those overflow qualities of Appalachian culture. And I'm about an hour, 15 hour and a half drive away from Asheville, North Carolina. So very much able to get back up into more Appalachia proper, perhaps. But it's been a great way to be able to stay connected to my region while still being closer to where my healthcare is and all sorts of different things that are things you have to think about when you decide where you want to live.
Well, I'm from Lee County, Virginia originally. So if you think about Virginia, the state and the shape, it's got a very odd shape, and it comes down to a point, a tiny, tiny point that sits on the intersection of Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Western North Carolina. And so we kind of get forgotten about down here by the rest of the state. So when we say, oh, I'm from Southwest Virginia, people are thinking Abingdon or Bristol, Virginia, or Roanoke even, and they don't think that there's that whole section that goes really, really far west into deep into central Appalachia. But that's where I grew up, the last county in Virginia going west, and I live about 30 minutes away from my hometown in a town called Big Stone Gap, which Adriana Trigiani made famous with her novel series Big Stone Gap, and then she made the movie Big Stone Gap. So it's a tiny little town, but it's a nice place to live. I teach at UVA Wise, which is in Wise County, which is 30 more minutes up the road. But I'm still very close to all of these Appalachian states. I'm glad you made the distinction between Southern and Appalachian, because I do think that's one of the things that people get confused about. They sort of, even though there's some overlap, they assume they're one and the same, when Appalachia is so big and so diverse.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And as someone from Appalachian, Ohio, there's a lot of confusion that Ohio is part of Appalachia. But when you look at the map, like it's a large portion of the state that is part of Appalachian culture. And my grandmother is very much not a Southern lady. I have one Southern grandmother and one Ohio grandmother. I really don't know what flavor my grandma Alice is, but she would sit on her porch and drink unsweet iced tea. And I feel like that exemplifies the difference in culture, because there is that aspect of visiting and communing with other people and community. But she is not a sweet tea drinker, and she's very straightforward, very practical, very blunt. And compared to my Southern grandmother, it's just very much so vastly different. And that's something that I really appreciated, was understanding Appalachian culture and Southern culture and how different they are because of my two grandmothers. And that was just really lovely, something to think about as I've worked on this project, because working on something that's so close to you personally,
Yeah.
you begin contemplating literature in the context of your own life.
And since you brought that up, one of the questions that I had told you I wanted to talk about is our literary lives. Who would you say, if you think about the timeline, okay, if you go all the way back to when you first began to read, who was your first really influential author, the one that you remember that really gave you that love of reading? It's hard to isolate one, but I'm thinking somebody from the childhood, and then somebody from that middle space, and then somebody later in your life up till now that really made a difference.
Well, I really loved Tamora Pierce. She wrote the Alana the Lioness Quartet. She wrote a lot of quartets about women and girls in air quotes male spaces. And so Alana becomes the first women knight in like 100 years or something. And it was something I didn't know I needed as a kid and as a teenager, to realize that smothering that I felt was the sexism that women and girls face on a daily basis. And seeing it in Alana's life made me be able to articulate that more. And so I loved all of Tamora Pierce's books. They're full of magic and lady knights and spy masters and all sorts of fun things. And so I've been doing a reread of her books this year, and it's been a delight. The audiobooks are wonderful. I'm a huge fan of full cast audio, and so they do several of Tamora Pierce's books. And so yeah, that's definitely high up there for me, for sure.
So was that your earliest? I mean,
Yeah, I would say
okay.
so.
And was there someone else that came along that like in your teen years or?
I would definitely think so. So for me, it was Virginia Woolf in undergrad. I was a creative writing major undergrad. I thought studying English would be incredibly boring because most of the books that I'd been assigned in high school to me were boring. And so there was this big change up my sophomore year of my program where they moved us from the comms department from one college to a different college to the English department, and it changed all of our requirements for the most part. And so it was a built-in that we would have a minor in English, but I only had 2 years to finish that minor on top of all of my capstone things and for my major. And so I had to take this deep dive and I chose novels because at least this will help me out.
Mhm.
And so we ended up in this modern literature class, and I found A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. We read that and a novel by her in the class. And it was just, it was life-changing for me. This idea that what I was trying to articulate in college was that there were people who didn't want women to be educated still, that the fact that women made up most of the English department was bad to some of the teachers in the department. Like they did not like that. And something, Virginia Woolf is Feminism 101, but it met me where I was at. And it really inspired me to continue reading into feminist literature. And,
Mhm.
Virginia Woolf is also she's mentally ill and chronically ill, and seeing another disabled person talk about these things in that context was very meaningful for me as well. So I could go on. Really appreciated what she did for me in my late teens, early 20s.
And who was the first Appalachian author that sort of opened your eyes to Appalachian literature?
That's a good question. I think for being from Appalachian, Ohio, it's very strange because growing up, we didn't consider ourselves Appalachian. It wasn't like an identity that we were aware of as much. I grew up going to West Virginia for summer camp, and I'd be there a lot, and I knew that was Appalachia because everything was named Appalachia in that area in Beckley. So I was like, okay, so I would have to say what really made me aware of that identity was the discussion around hillbilly elegy and reading Elizabeth Catt's work and just the way that she was able to put into words so many feelings that I had and so many complex feelings that I had. And she really grew me as a reader for sure. And I really appreciated that. And then since then, I've gone back and read a lot of earlier Appalachian literature and tried to get my hands on as much as possible. But yeah, she was really important for that development.
I guess mine started with Judy Blume. Judy Blume, my
Classic.
mom would trade books with people at work and she would bring books home and I would read them and she would take them back. My mom was kind of like my first library, but she brought Judy Blume home one day. Super Fudge, I think, was the first book I read of Judy Blume. Super Fudge. I mean, I loved reading because they read to me, but I remember that being the first time I really became interested in story and the art of storytelling because she's such a good writer and voice, and she's able to capture children so well. And I read everything that she wrote all the way up until, my teenage years. And one of her books was banned. And I got to tell her this story because I went to Key West and met her. She has a bookstore in Key West, and I actually met her and got to tell her this story. One of her books was banned from my high school, and I went to the public library and found it. Yay for public libraries.
Mhm.
But I drove my little 1973 red Volkswagen Beetle to the public library and I sat in the floor and read that book in its entirety until they started shutting the lights off because I wanted to see what was so bad that they had to ban it from our high school. And the book was Forever, which if anyone reads Judy Blume, they'll know what that's about. And then when I got older, starting around the 8th grade, I discovered Stephen King. And I thought I was just this weirdo that loved, I was obsessed with Stephen King. But after getting to know Amy Green, the author Amy Green, and Silas House talked about this too. They both loved Stephen King too. So Stephen King is such a powerful storyteller. And I really studied the way he told stories, and I remember I was in a conversation with Sharon McCrum one time about dialect, and I said that I liked Stephen King because I thought she would be a person who would like Stephen King too. And she said, well, he's a regional writer. And I said, I never thought about him as a regional writer. And she said, oh yeah, because I talked about how he writes in the authentic voices of his characters who are from Maine, and there's a very distinctive dialect that he uses. And she says, oh yeah, well, that makes him a regional writer. I mean, he's using the dialect. He's doing the same kinds of things that we do. Then when I got to college, and only when I got to college did I even know there was a thing called Appalachian literature, because I hadn't read any of those authors. And I think Lee Smith was the Fair and Tender Ladies was the first book, and then James Steele, River of Earth. And that helped me come into my identity as an Appalachian, which is something I didn't think about growing up either. I didn't think about what it meant to be Appalachian, or that being Appalachian was a thing. And when I saw my spoken voice on the pages of Lee Smith's work, I remember not being able to sleep at night because I thought, okay, this is a whole other path that I want to go down. And I think that work connected me back to the voices of my grandparents, and the front porch storytelling, and the words they used and the way that they pronounced them. Books are everything, and libraries. Mm-hmm. And I know you talked about that in a recent episode about how important we've got to protect our libraries.
Yeah. I'm wearing a Libraries Are Essential t-shirt from the Bitter Southerner today. They're always in the forefront of my mind. I love that you went to the public library and found that book, because those books are so important. And when I first started working in books, I just thought Banned Books Week was just a nod to something that happened in the past, and that it didn't happen that often anymore. But it was just something nice to do. And now Banned Books Week is just so vital to understanding books in this country. And I work as a contributing editor for Book Riot, and Kelly Jensen, my colleague there, she does a lot of work in the banned book space. And that's something that I cover a lot. And there's so many libraries across the region that are really fighting to keep these books in these spaces.
My whole family reads, and we are so lucky. We live just steps from our public library in Big Stone. So we walk to the library frequently and check out books. And, it's not just about books, though. I think what people forget about libraries is they offer so much access to so many other things.
Mm-hmm.
I always see people at the computers, they're using the internet there. They're using the computers to apply for jobs or to do the kind of work that they may not be able to do at home, and just so many different services.
100%. You mentioned discussing some of our favorite episodes that we recorded. So I think it'd be great to talk about those. And because we both cover a wide range of different topics within Appalachian literature and language and all sorts of things. So is there something that stands out to you that you've really loved working on?
It's hard because, we work so hard on every episode, but I was thinking about this, and I think what came to my mind was an episode I did on Appalachia's Scottish roots with Jack Beck. He's Scots, but he moved to the United States several years ago, and he and his wife, Wendy Welch, had a bookstore here in Big Stone Gap. And Wendy actually wrote a wonderful nonfiction book called The Little Bookstore of Big Stone Gap that did pretty well. And it documented, opening a brick and mortar bookstore in a small town in a digital age, and it wasn't just a bookstore. It was a place where the community gathered. They would host events and the community would gather, and they had cats for adoption. And it was just a wonderful little place. But I got to know Jack there. And so I teach a class called Dialects of the Appalachian Region. And Jack always lectures to my students about the Scottish influences on our dialects. And so that's one of my favorite episodes, because not only is Jack just full of information about those influences, and he ties our dialects to surnames and ballads and towns and places that you find here, but he's also a musician. He's a folk musician, and he sang a traditional Scottish ballad for us on the episode. And it's one of my favorites as far as the kind of information that I'm able to provide to people. One of the most exciting episodes was having Barbara Kingsolver on when she visited campus to talk about Demon Copperhead. That was a lot of fun because, you know, she's so inspiring anyway, but the voice of that book is just incredible. And so to hear her talk about how she was inspired to write it and how she wrote it was a lot of fun. But there are so many I could talk all day. What about you?
I really loved working on the first 3 episodes in particular because to me they nested in each other, and it was like the idea of, you know, what is Appalachian literature? What is it doing now? And where is it going? And so each episode looked at one of those questions. And Annette Snook-Clapsaddle came on to talk about like what is literature. And I think it's really important that when we talk about Appalachian literature, we are aware that, you know, most literature is written by people who are descendants of people who colonized, you know, the region. And so she's really such a wonderful gift to the literary community. She, you know, she's been an English teacher and now does most of her, you know, work as an author, but that was something really special and something I really loved. And then I talked to university and indie presses in the second episode, and then talked about like where Appalachian literature is going with Abby Freeland and Stacey Jane Grover, who are an author and her editor. And there's just something really special about Appalachian literature and where it comes from and the thought and the care. And so looking at it from all these different perspectives was just something that I really loved working on. And it was right out of the gate. So it was a lot, but it was a lot of fun for sure.
Now, one of the episodes you did kind of combines your work and my work. You talked about, I think it was episode 6, dialects in audiobooks. And how, you know, what happens when they get it wrong? What happens when they get it right? And it reminded me of Silas House. He did an essay in part 2 of Talking Appalachian. And he also talked about this in my interview where he was recording the audio for one of his books. And the director stopped him about his pronunciation of OIL, which he says, "ol." And that's how we say it here in Central Appalachia is "ol." He had to take 24 hours to think about that because when you change the way that you pronounce a word, we don't just say that randomly. That's how our family says it. That's how, you know, our parents say it or our grandparents say it. And so it's a big deal to say, well, we need to change that for clarity. And so he had to really think about it and consult people that he trusted before he could make that decision. But that was such an interesting episode about the care that you have to take with dialects in audiobook.
Yes, that's something I really loved about audio. And for folks who don't know, I'm disabled and at this point really struggle to read text for any length of time. So I primarily use audio to read emails and, you know, obviously audiobooks are how I read. And so I've heard a lot of terribly narrated Appalachian audiobooks. I don't really have a choice, so like I have to keep listening, but there's so many I wish I could just have stopped listening to and chose to read it in print. But I recently talked to Wes Brown, who wrote They All Fall the Same, and he talked about his narrator, Matt Godfrey, who did such a phenomenal job. And he said that he sent Matt Godfrey like this 15-minute voice message pronouncing all of these different words. And one of them is Karen, which is actually carry on is might pronounce it.
Was it Kjarn?
It's something similar, yes.
That's how we say it here, Kjarn.
But Matt Godfrey got it and he did it well. So it's something I really appreciated that he shared because it is really important to get that right. And his book is set in Eastern Kentucky. And Wes Brown, you know, he's not from Eastern Kentucky, but he's lived there like for the last few decades. So it's really interesting to hear how that comes about when audiobooks come into play.
Yeah. And I can see how it would be frustrating if you know an area and you know that they're not getting it right. And it's not, oh, let's just use a Southern accent and call it a day. Because one of the things that distinguishes Deep South from us is the R-lessness versus the R-fullness. So in Appalachian, Virginia, for example, we have a very R-full phonetic variant. It's like wash instead of wash. And that goes all the way up to Pittsburgh. that feature, wash. But if you travel east in Virginia to the flatlands, it's wash again. Or they drop their R's from the ends of words like dollar, shower. And here we're like holler. I live in a holler, right? It's yeller and I can open the window. So that artfulness is distinctive. And so I always know, you can always tell if they've done their research or if they understand the area that they're talking about for that
I
reason.
think that's so fascinating. I love linguistics and accents in particular. And, my dad, when he and my mom moved up to New Jersey, he lost his accent. And it, I've heard, him recording voice messages for my mom. They used to record cassettes because long distance calling was so expensive. They'd
Mm.
record on cassettes and mail them to each other, and that was cheaper. And so I've listened to him talk on one of these cassettes, and I was like, Mom, who is that? And she said, Oh, that's your dad. And I could not believe it. But because of the Southern Ohio accent, which I also have lost most of, it is very different. And it was just a light, though, to be able to
Mhm.
hear it and to hear him talk about what was going on in his life. And oh, it was
Yeah.
lovely.
I hope you have all those. Did they keep them?
I think my mom does. Yeah. She keeps
That's
all the
wonderful.
letters and
What a
different things.
treasure.
Yeah.
That's such a
Yeah.
treasure.
It really is. And, it makes me as someone who's moved away and intentionally lost my accent because people would make fun of me for like just like they did my dad up in New Jersey. It really makes you feel that sense of loss
Mhm.
of part of your culture by losing your accent. And it's not because, we're ashamed of culture. It's just trying to make it in a world outside the region. And there's a lot of complex feelings and identity in that. And so when it comes back around to audiobooks, it makes me really think about how the way we speak connects to culture and how our culture is portrayed.
I find that most of what is at the bottom of people who ridicule or dismiss vernacular dialects and accents is ignorance. They just don't know how language works. They don't know the rich linguistic history of language. And maybe they don't care. But I would hope that if they have that knowledge, that it would make a difference, especially Appalachian people, especially Appalachian kids, that they grow up with that understanding of why they sound the way that they do and where that comes from, because it's not random, it's not broken English, governed by very specific rules, and I think it's fascinating, and it's one of the things that I try to do too. Speaking of episodes, another favorite of mine is the episode on Cherokee language. I'm not just about dialects, but the diversity of language in Appalachia in general. And that's something that I want to keep exploring in the podcast going forward is what we don't think about. It's not just the Scots Irish, right? But we get so many of our place names from the Cherokee and other indigenous people. And that, a lot of that was wiped out by the boarding schools that were set up that they were forced to go to. And so the name of the documentary was We Will Speak, and it's about the Cherokee reclaiming their language and learning from the older generations before they're gone, learning the language and then learning how to be teachers of the language for the younger generations. And it's really inspiring. It's an inspiring documentary on saving a cornerstone of culture that would otherwise be extinct. And people ask me a lot if I think that accents and dialects will die out. And the answer, I don't think so. I don't think they will, because I still hear younger generations using the features that make it distinctive. My kids don't necessarily sound like me, maybe in their vowels. I think about radio. The invention of radio didn't kill it. The invention of television didn't kill it. The invention of the internet, didn't make it go away. And yes, we might standardize to a certain degree, but I know it's strong enough to keep people rooted to their communities, and I think a lot of people will keep using their accents or hold on to some aspects of their accents to stay connected to that
Yeah,
part of their identity.
I definitely think so. And, I think about, when I would be in meetings with, folks in New York who worked in books, and you had a wide range of accents because people from all over, um, you know, the world, even working in these meetings. We had so many different accents, but a lot of people pegged my accent with a little Southern dialect because of the way I say the word to. I don't say the word to, I say the word to, like I'm going to the store. And
Yeah.
they were like, I didn't know you were Southern, Kendra. And I'm like, I'm half. I don't know how to explain this. I just live here. Actually, from Ohio, they're like, we didn't think there were Southern accents in Ohio. I'm like, well, the Southern dialect is in Ohio. I don't know what to tell you. And so it would be a whole conversation because, so many English majors work in books.
Mhm.
And so we had a great time. And I keep thinking about that as I work on Read Appalachia, about how even if it's just small things, I feel like those will be preserved
Mhm.
in different regions and different accents and also turns of phrase. And, my husband's from California. And so sometimes I'll be like, he'll say something. I'll be like, well, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. He's like, what on earth? Here we are.
Mine is not from here. He's from Richmond, Virginia, which is not Appalachia, Virginia. And but he's been here now for about over 20 years, and so he's learned some of the phrases. But he's in physical therapy, so he's working with a patient, and he said that they krilled their ankle. Have you heard that phrase,
I
krill your
haven't.
ankle? So basically means to turn your ankle or twist your
Oh,
ankle, but it's a vernacular phrase, and he had never heard that. It's those neat little things that he hears that I get to talk about. But that actually led me to work with a historian here at UVA Wise. We're in Wise County. We're a small 4-year liberal arts college in the coalfields, but we are affiliated with UVA Charlottesville, which is the big UVA that everybody knows about. We collaborated with, and UVA has a pretty big medical school, and so we collaborated with folks up there to create a set of modules for people training in the medical field to work with Appalachian folks so that they would understand some of just like what my husband experienced. Like if someone comes to you and they're sharing something in their vernacular, or they're sharing a way that they're self-treating with, home remedies or things like that, you'll have a better understanding of. And we also did modules on the culture and history of Appalachia because, people are going to be more apt to open up and tell you how, what's wrong with them or how they're feeling if they think that you've done your research and you can relate a little bit, because now we have so much telehealth and telemedicine that's important to be able to communicate
yeah.
effectively, no matter who you're talking to.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love that. That's such a phenomenal idea. It's so interesting when having experienced healthcare work, people who come into the region for healthcare. I grew up going to SOMC, and one of my surgeons was Nigerian, and he just really got Appalachia in so many ways that in hindsight, I realize like it must have been really challenging. Not only you're moving to another country, but also like a tiny place in another country and like all these different things. And he was just so kind and listened and did so many great things. But I can only imagine how difficult that was to get used to a new accent, very strong accents. And
It's something I tell my husband. Some of the people are more hesitant, I think, to talk about health and wellness. You grow up with this culture of you keep it quiet, or in some cases you lean on your faith for healing, and so you might be hesitant to rely on treatment, certain kinds of treatment. So there's so many things that you need to consider when you're treating people in another place. Not just Appalachia, but I think anywhere. I think it's important to get to know the place and the region that you're talking about and not rely on assumption and stereotype.
Mhm.
And that brings me back to the literature and why I think literature is so important. You were talking about preservation. I work a lot with teachers in pedagogy and dialect and, culturally sensitive ways to, particularly in English. You've got an English background, so you know what it's like. There's this traditional way of teaching where you just mark everything up on a paper and you call it wrong. And if dialect makes its way in there, vernacular dialect makes its way in there, and you mark it up and call it wrong, you're calling their mama and papa wrong, and you're calling the preacher in their church wrong. They may have written it the way they heard it, and they thought that was. And so, the marking up with red ink isn't necessarily the way to go. But, I'll occasionally run into somebody that'll say, well, I just don't see a reason why it's helpful to hold on to this. They're going to be more empowered if they just learn standard English and only use standard English. And so I pull out Langston Hughes' Mother to Son, the poem Mother to Son, that is written in this pure vernacular voice of a mother who has a very distinctive accent. And I say, I want you to standardize this poem. I want you to rewrite this poem in standard English. And we're going to read both versions out loud. And you tell me which one sounds better, Langston Hughes or the standard English version. It becomes a whole different, bland, ugly piece. It's just not the same. She loses everything about her voice that is so distinctive. The Black mother who's been through so much difficulty talking to her son, you lose all of that. That's my teaching moment when I say this is why we keep it. This is why we preserve it. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of Desmond Ward's literature, the novels that she writes. Before I realized identity in Appalachian literature, there was something about Desmond Ward in Southern literature that really hit me first, that regional literature, air quotes, is still universal in all the other ways that the other books are. And it was through Desmond Ward's writing, and I love Solids of Bones, and I listened to the audiobook, and I went and found Desmond Ward reading the book, and just the way that she read her own prose was just captivating. The rhythm and the accent and the turns of phrase, the way that she read her descriptions versus dialogue, it was just a beautiful moment and really made me start thinking about literature, contemporary literature, in so many new ways. And I love to see her success. I love to see her boggle the minds of people from literary bastions in cities, wonder like, how did she get here? And it's like, obviously she got here because look at all the storytelling she has and her culture and background and the beautiful language. It's just, I could gush about her forever, but I love her so much and what she does for literature. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, as a linguist, as someone who really loves language and looks at literature from that perspective, is there a particular book that you really love for that? We've talked about some of them today, but is there one that stands out to you that where you can see this language come off the page in a new way that you didn't expect, or maybe it's a newer writer that you found that you've also really loved, or really anything you want to share along those lines?
I think about the way Barbara Kingsolver used language in Demon Copperhead, and how she's so good at taking it as far as she can take it without making the character look like a caricature. She's just got this perfect way of giving him, that demon, the voice that he needs to, and as he grows, because, he starts as a child. And Ron Rash also comes to my mind. Poetry is not my go-to necessarily when I'm reading, but Ron Rash's book of poems, it's got a green cover. I think it's literally called Poems by Ron Rash, is one of my favorites because of the way that he just masterfully uses language in that book. And he's even got a poem in there called Accent, where he talks about how our dialects were formed and what he hears when he hears people speaking. So
poetry, because it's so true. Like, especially when you listen to a poet read their own work, the rhythms of the language or something that, when I think about accent, come to the forefront of my mind. And to be able to hear that, I think about Bernard Clay's poem, English, I think it's English Lit, the title poem for his collection. I could be getting the title slightly off, but when he read that poem for Poetry Corner, it was just phenomenal. It was like, I go back and I listen to him read that poem because it is so good. The way he does the accent, and it's such a phenomenal poem as well. So poetry is just magic. And that's one of the reasons why think poetry is so underappreciated is because it just captures language
It
so
does.
well and it's so beautiful.
I'm going to go back. Okay. The author I would say really turned me on, or that really comes to my mind when I think this is the person, this would be my first book. And it just blew my mind when I read it for the first time. It was Denise Giardina's Storming Heaven. Have you read that one?
I haven't, but I'm writing it down right now.
Denise Giardina is a West Virginia author. Storming Heaven was based on true stories about the mining wars of the late 19th century, early 20th century, when the mines were beginning to be organized and unionized. And then The Unquiet Earth is the sequel. But she writes that book, and I think something like 13 different voices tell that story. And from Italian immigrants in the coal mines to, people there from West Virginia. And the opening line is, "They is many a way to mark a baby while it is yet in the womb." And she talks about the folklore about being marked while you're pregnant. But that opening line, I just remember, blew me away because it's got almost every variant in it of Appalachian English, and it's so remarkable. And she writes that book so fluently in the Appalachian voices of the people in these coal mine communities. And so I can't say enough about Storming Heaven and how many times I've read it. If you saw my copy of Storming Heaven, it is so dog-eared and tattered, but I never get tired of reading it for that reason. It's like a rich dessert for me to read language that is so well written and so well preserved.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to go find it. And it's going to be one of the many books that I take from this conversation and go on like Pango.
I'm working on my third nonfiction book right now, and I'm doing that one with UVA Press because they've just created an imprint called Rivanna, and they're going to start publishing regional books, Appalachian books.
That sounds phenomenal. I'm excited. I'm going to go look that up. I'm really excited for you. And I'm also working on an anthology of disabled writers.
I saw that.
UPK.
Yes.
If you have anyone, of any level of writing skill, students, new writers, experienced writers, who might be interested in applying, still have a lot of room left in the anthology. So I'm reaching out to various guests of the pod as well, just to see, because it's, we haven't had a ton of submissions, as many as I would thought. So been going out and seeking them, and yeah, so lots of room left. I love to have Virginia represented in the group as well, for sure.
Well, this has been fun, Kendra. I've enjoyed it so much.
Yes, I'm so happy we have this crossover episode, and I could chat language with you all day. But yeah, I love hearing your thoughts on accents and literature and those intersections, and it's been such a wonderful time.